Welcome to the Memoirs of Baron de Marbot. In these pages, Baron Jean-Baptiste Antoine Marcellin de Marbot looks back on a life that spanned one of the most turbulent and extraordinary periods in European history. Born in 1782 in Corrèze, France, Marbot grew up amid the storms of the French Revolution. He witnessed the fall of the monarchy, the rise of the Republic, the glory and collapse of Napoleon's empire, and the return of the Bourbons. He served with distinction on the staffs of Napoleon's most celebrated marshals: Bernadotte, Augereau, Murat, Lannes, and Masséna. He met emperors, kings, and princes. He marched in some of the greatest campaigns of the age, survived the fall of empires, and endured exile. Through it all, he remained both soldier and observer, a man whose loyalty to family and sense of fortune never faltered, even in times of hardship. Unlike official histories, Marbot's memoirs are intimate and vivid. They reveal not only the grand sweep of war and politics, but also the personal, the humorous, and the tragic episodes that shaped his destiny. They are written, as he tells us, not with the flourish of a historian, but with the plain voice of a man speaking to his wife and children, a soldier leaving behind his truth for the next generation. Now, let us begin with Marbot's own words, as he sets out to recount his life and times. My dear wife, my dear children, I witnessed, although still quite young, the great and terrible revolution of 1789. I lived under the Convention and the Directory. I saw the empire. I took part in its gigantic wars and narrowly escaped being crushed by its fall. I often approached Emperor Napoleon. I served on the general staff of 5 of his most famous marshals: Bernadotte, Augereau, Murat, Lannes, and Masséna. I knew all the prominent figures of that era. I suffered exile in 1815. I had the honor of seeing King Louis-Philippe very often, when he was still only the Duke of Orléans, and after 1830, I served for 12 years as aide-de-camp to his august son, the royal prince, now Duke of Orléans. Finally, since a tragic event took this prince from the love of the French people, I have been attached to the person of his august son, the Count of Paris. I have therefore been witness to many events. I have seen much, retained much, and since you have long wished that I write my memoirs, combining the account of my life with that of the memorable events I witnessed, I yield to your repeated requests. As you are far more eager to know the details of what happened to me than to see me describe at length historical facts already recorded in a multitude of books, I will speak of those facts only briefly, to mark the different eras of the times I lived through and the influence these events had on my destiny. I will be more explicit regarding people. I will correct, with impartiality, the judgments made about those I had the opportunity to know. As for the style, it will be unpretentious, as befits a simple account written for the family. Alongside events of the highest political importance, I will recount cheerful, bizarre, even trivial episodes, and will go into details regarding personal matters which may perhaps seem idle. Almost all men complain about their fate. Providence has treated me better, and although my life has certainly not been without trials, the amount of happiness has been infinitely greater than that of sorrow, and I would gladly begin my career again without changing anything. Shall I say it? I have always been convinced that I was born fortunate. In war, as in politics, I have stayed afloat amidst the storms that engulfed nearly all of my contemporaries, and I find myself surrounded by a tender and devoted family. I therefore give thanks to Providence for the share it has granted me. I was born on August 18th, 1782, at the Château de la Rivière, which my father owned on the banks of the Dordogne, in the beautiful and cheerful valley of Beaulieu, on the borders of Limousin and Quercy, today the department of Corrèze. My father was an only son. His father and grandfather had also been only sons, so a very considerable landed fortune for the province had accumulated in his hands. The Marbot family was of noble origin, although for a long time it had not preceded its name with any title. according to the expression of that time, it lived nobly, that is to say, on its own income, without engaging in any trade or profession. It was allied with several gentlemen of the region and socialized with others, such as the Dumières, d'Estrées, Cosnac, La Majorie, and so on. I make this observation because, at a time when the nobility was so haughty and powerful, the friendship that united the Marbot family with illustrious houses, which counted several marshals of France among their ancestors, proves that our family enjoyed great respect in the region. My father was born in 1753. He received an excellent education and was very well read. He loved learning, literature, and the arts. His somewhat fiery character had been tempered by the habits of the good society in which he lived. His heart, moreover, was so kind that, once his first outburst had passed, he always sought to make amends for any abruptness. My father was a handsome man, very tall and strongly built. His dark, masculine, and stern face was very beautiful and regular. My grandfather became a widower while his son was still in school, so his household was managed by one of his elderly cousins, the eldest of the Mrs. Houdinet of Beaulieu. This relative rendered great service to my grandfather, who, having become nearly blind, following a lightning strike that hit nearby, no longer left his manor. Thus, when my father entered society, he found himself between an infirm old man and an aunt devoted to his every wish, and he was free to manage the family fortune as he pleased. He did not abuse this freedom, but, as he had a very strong inclination for the military profession, which was constantly stirred by his friendships with the young noblemen of the area, he accepted a proposal from Colonel Marquis d'Estrées, a neighbor and family friend, to be admitted into the King Louis XV's bodyguards. Upon entering the guards, my father received the commission of sub-lieutenant. After a few years, he was promoted to lieutenant of the guards. Through the support of the Marquis d'Estrées, he was introduced to several households in Paris, notably that of Lieutenant General Count de Schomberg, Inspector General of Cavalry. The latter, recognizing my father's merits, appointed him captain in his dragoon regiment in 1781, and took him as his aide-de-camp in 1782. My grandfather had just died, my father was still unmarried, and his fortune and position, a captain was at that time in the provinces a man of some importance, allowed him to choose a wife without fear of being refused. At that time, at the Château de la Val-de-Serre, located 1 league from that of La Rivière, which belonged to my father, there lived a noble but not wealthy family named de Certain. The head of this house, afflicted with gout, had his affairs managed by Madame de Certain, a woman of rare merit. She came from the noble family of Verdal, which, as you know, claims to count Saint-Roch among the relatives on its maternal side, saying that a Verdal married a sister of Saint-Roch in Montpellier. I do not know how well-founded this claim is, but it is certain that before the Revolution of 1789, there existed at the entrance of the old Château de Grugnac, still owned by the Verdal family, a stone bench held in great veneration by the mountain villagers nearby, because, according to tradition, Saint-Roch, when visiting his sister, liked to sit on this bench, from which one could see the countryside, something impossible from the château, a gloomy fortress. Mr. and Mrs. de Certain had 3 sons and 1 daughter, and, according to the custom of the time, they added to their family name that of a domain. Thus, the eldest son took the surname Canrobert, still borne by his son, our cousin, who has since so greatly distinguished it. The eldest son of the Certain family was, at the time I refer to, a knight of Saint Louis and captain in the Penthièvre infantry regiment. The second son was called de Lisle and was a lieutenant in the same regiment. The third son took the name Lacoste and served, like my father, in the bodyguards. The daughter was called Mademoiselle Dupuis. She became my mother. My father formed a close friendship with Mr. Certain de Lacoste, and it could hardly have been otherwise, for besides the 3 months they spent at the Hôtel de Versailles during their service, the trips they made together twice a year only strengthened their bond. Public coaches were very rare at the time, dirty, uncomfortable, and moved slowly. Besides, it was not considered fashionable to use them. Elderly or ill nobles took hired carriages, while young nobles and officers travelled on horseback. Among the bodyguards, a custom had thus developed, which, nowadays, would seem very odd, since these gentlemen only served for 3 months each year, and the corps was therefore divided into 4 roughly equal parts, those among them from Brittany, Auvergne, Limousin, and other regions that provided good little horses had bought a number of them whose price was not to exceed 100 francs, including saddle and bridle. On the appointed day, all the bodyguards from the same province, called back to duty, would gather on horseback at a designated point, and the merry caravan would set off for Versailles. They would cover 12 to 15 leagues per day, assured of finding each evening, at agreed-upon and moderate prices, good lodging and a good supper in the inns selected as stops, for they were expected on set days. The journey was made joyfully, chatting, singing, braving bad weather or heat, as well as mishaps, and laughing at the amusing stories each had to tell in turn along the way. The caravan would grow as it was joined by bodyguards from the provinces it passed through. Finally, the various groups, arriving from all parts of France, entered Versailles on the very day their leave ended, and thus at the exact moment when the guards they were to relieve were preparing to depart. Then, each of these outgoing guards would buy one of the ponies brought by the new arrivals, paying them 100 francs, and, forming new caravans, they would all set off for their ancestral homes. Upon returning to their estates, they would release the crickets, as they called the ponies, into the meadows, where they grazed freely for 9 months, until it was time to bring them back to Versailles and sell them to other comrades. In this way, the horses, constantly changing owners, travelled from one province of France to another. My father therefore became very close with Mr. Certain de Lacoste, who was in the same quarter and served with him in the company of Noailles. Once back in the region, they saw each other frequently, and my father soon became friends with his brothers. Mademoiselle Dupuis was pretty, witty, and although she had only a very small dowry and several wealthy matches were offered to my father, he preferred Mademoiselle Dupuis and married her in 1776. We were 4 brothers. The eldest, Adolphe, now a Maréchal de Camp, I was the second, Theodore the third, and Félix the youngest. Our ages followed at roughly 2-year intervals. I was very strongly built and had no illness other than smallpox, but I nearly died from an accident, which I will now recount. I was only 3 years old when it happened, but it was so serious that the memory remains engraved in my mind. As I had a slightly upturned nose and a round face, my father had nicknamed me the little cat. That was enough to give such a young child the desire to imitate a cat. My greatest joy was to crawl on all fours while meowing, and I had developed the habit of going daily to the 2nd floor of the chateau to visit my father in a library where he spent the hottest hours of the day. As soon as he heard the meowing of his little cat, he would come open the door and give me a volume of Buffon's works, whose engravings I would look at while my father continued his reading. I loved these sessions immensely, but one day my visit was not received as kindly as usual. My father, probably occupied with serious matters, did not open the door to his little cat. In vain, I intensified my meowing in the softest tones I could muster. The door remained closed. I then noticed, at floor level, a hole called a cat flap, which in southern chateaux existed at the bottom of all doors, allowing cats free access to rooms. That path seemed naturally made for me. I slipped in gently. My head passed through, but my body could not follow. I tried to pull back, but my head was stuck, and I could neither move forward nor backward. I was choking. Yet, I had so fully embraced my role as a cat that instead of speaking to alert my father to the trouble I was in, I meowed with all my might. Not sweetly, but like an angry cat, a strangled cat. Apparently, I did it so naturally that my father, convinced I was joking, burst into uncontrollable laughter. But suddenly the meowing weakened, my face turned blue, I lost consciousness. Imagine my father's alarm when he realized the truth. He removed the door from its hinges, not without difficulty, freed me, and carried me unconscious to my mother, who, thinking me dead, had a terrible fit herself. When I came to, a surgeon was bleeding me. The sight of my own blood and the concern of all the chateau's residents gathered around my mother and me made such a vivid impression on my young imagination that the memory of this event remains deeply etched in my mind. While my childhood passed peacefully, very serious events were brewing. The revolutionary storm was already rumbling, and it did not take long to break. It was the year 1789. The meeting of the Estates General, stirring all passions, destroyed the tranquillity that the province we lived in had enjoyed, and brought division into nearly all families, especially ours. My father, who had long criticized the abuses to which France was subjected, embraced the principle of the reforms that were being proposed, without foreseeing the atrocities those changes would bring about. Meanwhile, his three brothers-in-law and his friends rejected any form of innovation. This led to heated arguments, which I did not understand, but which distressed me, because I saw my mother weeping as she tried to calm the anger of her brothers and her husband. However, without quite knowing why, I took the side of the moderate Democrats who had chosen my father as their leader, for he was unquestionably the most capable man in the region. The Constituent Assembly had just abolished feudal rents. My father, as a gentleman, owned a few such rents that his father had purchased. He was the first to comply with the law. The commoners, who had been waiting for my father to set the example before deciding, refused to pay anything further once they learned that he had renounced the feudal rents he held. Shortly afterward, France having been divided into departments, my father was appointed administrator of the Corrèze, and soon after that, he became a member of the Legislative Assembly. My mother's three brothers and nearly all the local nobility had quickly emigrated. War seemed imminent. Then, to encourage all citizens to arm themselves, or perhaps also to assess how much he could rely on the energy of the population, the government, on a given day, spread word through every commune in France that brigands, led by émigrés, were coming to destroy the new institutions. The alarm bell rang from every church. Everyone armed themselves with whatever they could find, and the National Guards were organized. The country took on a fully military appearance, and everyone awaited the supposed brigands, who, in every commune, were said to be in the next one. No one appeared, but the effect had been achieved. France was under arms and had proven itself capable of defending itself. We were then in the countryside, alone with my mother. This alert, which was called the Day of Fear in our region, surprised me and would probably have frightened me, had I not seen my mother remain quite calm. I have always believed that my father, knowing her discretion, had warned her of what was to come. At first, everything passed without excess on the part of the peasants, who, in our region, had retained a great respect for old families. But soon, incited by demagogues from the towns, the country people descended on noble estates under the pretext of searching for hidden émigrés, but in truth, to demand money and seize feudal rent documents, which they burned in great bonfires. From the top of our terrace, we saw these frenzied people running, torch in hand, toward the Château d'Estrées, whose men had all emigrated and which was inhabited only by women. They were my mother's dearest friends, so she was deeply affected by what, even in my extreme youth, I called brigandage. My mother's anxieties increased when she saw her elderly mother arrive, having just been driven from her chateau, which had been declared national property due to the emigration of her three sons. Until then, my father's home had been spared, all the more so because his patriotism was well known, and, to demonstrate it even further, he had taken up military service in the army of the Pyrenees as captain of the mountain chasseurs after his term in the Legislative Assembly had ended. But the revolutionary tide, levelling everything in its path, eventually reached us. The house at Saint-Céré, which my father had bought 10 years earlier from Monsieur de l'Apollonie, was confiscated and declared national property because the deed of sale had been made privately and the seller had emigrated before ratifying it before a notary. My mother was given only a few days to remove her linens, and then the house was auctioned off and bought by the president of the district, who had himself initiated the confiscation. Finally, the peasants, stirred up by a few agitators from Beaulieu, came in force to my father's chateau. With all the courtesy possible, and even a sort of politeness, they told my mother that they could not avoid burning the remaining feudal rent documents and checking whether her émigré brothers were hiding in the chateau. My mother received them with great courage, handed over the documents, and pointed out that, knowing her brothers to be intelligent men, no one should suppose that they had emigrated only to return and hide in her chateau. They admitted the soundness of this reasoning, drank and ate, burned the documents in the courtyard, and left without causing any damage, shouting, "Long live the nation and citizen Marbot!" They even asked my mother to write and tell him that they loved him dearly and that his family was safe among them. Despite this assurance, my mother understood that her status as the sister of émigrés might bring her serious trouble, from which even her role as the wife of a defender of the homeland might not protect her. She resolved to leave temporarily. She told me later that what led her to make this decision was her belief that the revolutionary storm would last only a few months, something many others believed as well. My grandmother had 7 brothers, all of whom, in keeping with the traditions of the Verdal family, had been military men and Knights of St. Louis. One of them, a former battalion commander in the Penthièvre infantry regiment, had, upon retiring, married the wealthy widow of a parliamentary councillor in Rennes. My mother resolved to go to her and was preparing to leave, intending to take me with her, when I was afflicted with a large number of very painful boils. It was impossible to travel with an 8-year-old child in such a condition, and as the condition persisted, my mother found herself in great perplexity. She was relieved by a respectable lady, Mademoiselle Mongalvi, who was devoted to her and whose memory will always be dear to me. Mademoiselle Mongalvi, who took in a few boarders in Touraine, of whom my mother had once been one of the first, offered to take me in during my mother's short absence. My mother consulted my father, and once his consent had arrived, I left and was installed in the girls' boarding school. What? You might say, a boy among young girls? Yes, indeed, but consider that I was a very gentle, quiet, obedient child, and only 8 years old. The boarders admitted to Mademoiselle Mongalvi's house since my mother's time were young women aged 16 to 20. The youngest were at least 14, and they were sensible enough for me to be admitted among them. At my arrival, the whole little female flock rushed to meet me and received me with such joyful cries and kind caresses that I immediately rejoiced in having made the trip. Besides, I believed my stay would be brief, and I even think I was a little sad that I would have only a short time to spend with these kind young ladies, who gave me everything that could please me and competed to hold my hand. However, my mother departed and went to my uncle. Events moved quickly. The terror drenched France in blood. Civil war broke out in Vendée and Brittany. It became absolutely impossible to travel there, so my mother, who had planned to stay only 2 or 3 months in Rennes, found herself kept there against her will for several years. My father continued to fight in the Pyrenees and in Spain, where his skill and courage had earned him the rank of divisional general. Having entered the boarding school for only a few months, I thus remained there for at least 4 years, which were for me years of happiness, though sometimes clouded by the memory of my parents. But the good ladies Mongalvi and their pupils then showered me with affection and dispelled the sad thoughts that occasionally overwhelmed me. When, many years later, I read the story of Ververt living among the Visitandines of Nevers, I exclaimed, "That's exactly how I was at the boarding school in Touraine." Like him, I was spoiled beyond all measure by the mistresses and by the boarders. I had only to wish for something to receive it, Nothing was good or beautiful enough for me. My health had become perfect again. I was fair-skinned and fresh, and everyone wanted to kiss me. During the recreations that took place in a very large enclosed area containing a beautiful garden, meadows, vineyards, and groves, the young girls would crown me and garland me with flowers. Then, placing me on a small stretcher covered with roses, they would take turns carrying me while singing. At other times, I played tag with them, always having the privilege of catching others without ever being caught. They read me stories, sang me songs. Everyone wanted to do something for me. I remember that when we learned of the horrible execution of Louis XVI, Madame Mongalvi made the whole school kneel to say prayers for the soul of the unfortunate king. The indiscretion of any one of us could have brought serious consequences for her on that occasion, but all her pupils were old enough to understand, and I sensed that it was not to be spoken of. No one outside the house ever heard about it. That concludes the first part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.